Good afternoon. Welcome to the Genie Out of the Bottle from Jonge Geesten. We are pleased that Sophie Howe, our world's only Future Generations Commissioner, will be speaking today. According to Sophie, we need to strengthen leadership skills at all levels to deliver on the goals of the well-being of the Future Generations Act. Therefore, organizations, public and private, have to get out of their siloed area and face the fact that they have to develop leadership for all generations, senior, medium and junior. It goes without saying that this message is straight into my heart, and I hope it's going into your heart also. Sophie is currently a member of the Wales Committee of the Equality of Human Rights Commission, and her role as Future Generations Commissioner is to act as a guardian for the interest of future generations in Wales. But why only Wales, Sophie? As we need more commissioners to help to deliver this necessary message, not just for us, but for the future and the unborn generation. I'm pleased to give you the word, Sophie.
Thank you. Really pleased to be with you this afternoon and to share some thinking and some learning from Wales. So as you heard, I am the only Future Generations Commissioner in the world. My role was created as a result of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which was passed in our Welsh Parliament in 2015, and I came into post in 2016. And the legislation is internationally groundbreaking, so we are the only country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations and to align our aspirations for Wales, our goals for the Wales that we want to leave behind to our children and grandchildren with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the legislation does, and then perhaps a little bit about some of the challenges and the progress that we've made in Wales since passing the legislation. So I suppose the overarching principle of the legislation is that it requires all of our public bodies in Wales, that's some 44 public bodies. It includes all of our local authorities or municipalities. It includes our health service, our health boards. It includes national organisations like Natural Resources Wales, who deal with the environment, Public Health Wales, Sport Wales, and so on. And significantly, the Welsh Government itself, to demonstrate how they are taking decisions in a way which meets today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And in order to be able to demonstrate that, it sets out a number of ways which public bodies must act. So they must demonstrate how they are applying the Sustainable Development Principle, and that's set out as how they're thinking and planning for the long term, so recognising the long-term impact of the things they do or indeed don't do, preventing problems from occurring or from getting worse, integrating their thinking, so recognising the knock-on consequences that a decision, say, in the economy or on the economy might have in respect to the environment and so on. Collaborating with each other and other sectors, so the voluntary sector and the private sector, and then involving citizens. And then the Act sets out 7 national wellbeing goals, as I said, for the Wales that we want to leave behind to our children and our grandchildren. And those goals are, nothing you could disagree with, really, in terms of the titles. So a prosperous Wales, a more resilient Wales, which is about ecological resilience, a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, a Wales of cohesive communities, and a globally responsible Wales. And but I suppose each one of those goals has a statutory definition attached to it. So I just want to highlight the definition of a prosperous Wales, which is quite progressive in that it talks about a productive, innovative, low carbon society, which uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, which focuses on skills, for a well-educated population with access to decent jobs. So you will see there that our definition of prosperity in Wales does not include prosperity is all about increasing GVA or GDP, because we've seen, what happens where there is a sole focus in that area. We can increase GDP and GVA whilst destroying the planet and whilst increasing an inequality gap. So our legislation requires us to think holistically about well-being, it sets out these 4 pillars of well-being, of which the goals contribute to: social, economic, environmental and cultural. And if you have a background in the sustainable development field, you will know that the definition tends to just be social, economic, environmental well-being, and we've got that added dimension of culture, which actually I think is something which is missing from the UN SDGs, but is an important element to consider. And then the legislation establishes the role of a Future Generations Commissioner, which is, put simply, in statute. My role is to act as the guardian of the interests of future generations of Wales. So no pressure there, just a small task to keep me busy. And my role is independent of government. So I have duties to monitor and assess government and the other public bodies in terms of how they are implementing the Future Generations Act and how they're making I suppose in terms of, I'm often asked, you know, what are the teeth of the Commissioner's powers? And I suppose that the crunchiest end of my powers are what are called Section 20 reviews. So I can go into a particular organisation or collection of organisations and review what they're doing and make statutory recommendations of how they should improve things, which they have a duty to respond to and to follow, unless they can outline a good reason why they can't follow those particular recommendations. So I can't force anyone to do anything or stop anyone doing anything. But what we've seen so far is the power of someone calling out governments and other organisations in terms of whether they're acting in the interests of future generations is really quite significant. So let me just focus on a few of those areas where things are starting to change. I suppose the biggest test of the legislation and of my role, or biggest early test, if you like, came in respect of a decision that the Welsh Government had on its books for around a decade, which involved constructing a 13-mile stretch of motorway where there was a big problem with congestion. And that was quite interesting for a number of reasons. One, because prior to that, the Welsh Government had not had borrowing powers, so they weren't able to undertake public sector borrowing, but they acquired borrowing powers to spend on this road. The road was due to go through a large nature reserve, damaging the biodiversity in a way which couldn't be mitigated. And it had been widely agreed that, you know, or widely thought that that was a done deal, that road was going to go ahead, that the economic benefits were such, you know, there was the economic modelling around how much money it cost in the economy to be stuck in congestion for X amount of time. And so that decision was likely to go ahead, and it went to a public inquiry, and I intervened in that issue and asked the government to explain to me how that decision was in the interests of Future Generations Act and how they had applied the principles within that legislation. So how they'd taken into consideration long-term trends around the changing nature of mobility, alongside long-term trends and requirements around reducing our carbon emissions. I asked them to explain to me how it was contributing to the goal of a prosperous Wales as defined in our legislation, which is about productivity, innovation, a low carbon society using resources efficiently and proportionately, not purely about increasing GVA. I asked them to explain to me how they were meeting their biodiversity obligations when it was damaging this particular nature reserve. I asked them to explain to me how they considered the goal of a more equal Wales when we saw that 25% of the most socially economically deprived people in that region didn't even have access to a car. So therefore we'd be spending the entire of the Welsh Government's borrowing capacity on a road which didn't benefit the poorest people, didn't address socioeconomic disadvantage, and also to explain to me how it was contributing to the goal of a healthier Wales, when actually what we need to do is to get people out of their cars onto public transport using active travel, cycling, walking, and so on. And I think it's fair to say the government had a tough time in explaining that to me. Their lawyers had a reasonable stab at it, but ultimately the decision changed, and the First Minister took a view that he placed more weight on the environmental considerations and the issues contained within the Future Generations Act than the economy, if you like. So he was basically saying economic interest cannot trump environmental, societal and cultural interests in a way that it's consistently done in the past, and in a way I would argue that's probably landed us in a number of the problems that we're in at the moment, in terms of intergenerational injustice, in terms of climate change, in terms of poor health, and so on. So that was a big and significant test of the Act, but there's lots more changing. Every year I monitor the Welsh Government's budget to see whether their spending plans and decisions are in line with their obligations under the Future Generations Act. So I should say that the Act specifically covers a number of corporate areas for each public body. So it requires them to consider how the Act should be applied in their budgeting decisions, in how they procure goods and services, in terms of their assets, so their buildings and so on, and estates management, in terms of their workforce, how they're applying those principles around planning for the future and so on in their workforce, and in terms of their corporate planning and risk management. And so every year in particular, I look at the Welsh Government's budget and I challenge them on how they're applying those the principles of the Act in their spending decisions. One of the biggest challenges with that is getting them to shift to preventative spend. And this is of critical importance. So I agreed a definition of preventative spend with the government, because prior to that we weren't actually able to track what you define as preventative spend. Is preventative spend in the National Health Service giving someone a hip replacement? I would argue it's probably not primary preventative spend, but it could be argued that if you're replacing their hip in order that they don't then have social care needs and they're not facing loneliness and isolation and so on, then there could be an element of prevention there. But specifically we agreed a definition, and I've started tracking now how that definition is being applied. The government are improving in that regard, but still have a long way to go. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges for all of our public services, that long-term thinking and spending money to meet long-term objectives and to prevent problems from occurring is incredibly challenging, especially when you're trying to manage the demand of the here and now, whilst also trying to free some resources and headspace to prevent problems from occurring. But that's so important, because if we think about the things that that sort of contribute, for example, to our health, in Wales and indeed in the UK, we spend around 50% of our Welsh Government budget on our national healthcare system. And you will, if you know anything about the Brits are passionate about their National Health Service, absolutely rightly. The problem that we have, however, is it's not really a National Health Service, it's a National Illness Service, because what we do is we treat people when they're ill. We very rarely focus on preventing them from becoming ill in the first place. And actually, if you look at the World Health Organization work around health inequalities, what we see is that only 10% of what makes a difference to a nation's health and well-being is what happens in their healthcare system. The biggest wider determinants of people's health are completely outside of that. So about 35% is to do with kind of social security, whether you live in poverty and so on. About 29% is to do with your living conditions. Are you living in areas of high air pollution? How safe and secure is your housing? Do you live in good quality housing? Do you have access to nature, and so on? And then about 14% is relating to relationships. So whether you have a sense of agency in your community, whether you have someone who you can turn to in your hour of need, what sort of relationships do you hold? So when you start to think about that in terms of the way that public policy has operated for very many years, I often talk about us parking our ambulance at the bottom of a cliff and waiting for someone to fall off. And then we'll catch you and repair you when you've fallen off the cliff. But actually what we need to do is to park our ambulance at the top of the cliff and stop people falling off in the first place. And to do that, we need integrated thinking. So this is back to these principles within the legislation, the principle of integration, recognizing the connections between the different areas of policy. And so I just want to give you an example of where that's really beginning to have some traction in the way that we're doing business in Wales. So in our capital city, Cardiff, we have some significant problems with poor quality air. Our neighbourhoods, our communities in the south of the city are amongst the most economically deprived of any parts of Wales. We have a big problem. It's a capital city. We have people coming from far and wide to work and for leisure and so on. We have a big problem with congestion. And the leaders in our capital city, and what I should say, the Act also creates something called Public Services Boards, which is a culmination of all of the key public services in each area who have to come together and set a wellbeing plan to meet their obligations under the Future Generations Act. And they decided collectively that they would try to address this issue using the lens of the Future Generations Act. And the whole purpose there really is to think to, how do we prevent problems? How do we think to the long term? But how, when we're going about doing something, do we look at the art of the possible? How do we solve problems in a way which doesn't just solve, say, one problem with congestion? You could solve a problem with congestion by widening a road. That might work in the short term. However, longer term, it's likely to generate more problems. And it's not really addressing any of those issues I talked about in terms of health. But how do you think about it in an integrated way? So the first thing they did is they brought in a public health consultant to lead the transportation strategy for the city. And you get an entirely different approach to transportation thinking when you put a public health lens on it. So what's happened as a result of that is that, sorry, I'm just plugging my computer in before it goes dead. What's happened as a result of that is that we have seen a mass increase in bikes for hire in the city, so a huge increase in uptake in active travel. We're seeing the council invest in cycle superhighways, but start in those cycle superhighways from the most economically deprived areas where life expectancy is at its lowest. The difference in life expectancy between the north, the richer parts of Cardiff, and the south, the poorer areas, is 10 years. In one city, a life expectancy gap of 10 years. So those people would benefit from increasing their active travel and improving their health and using the cycling and walking infrastructure to do that. They also are more likely to live in areas of high air pollution. So by investing in active travel there, we're seeing that reduction in air pollution. And then they've gone beyond that and they've actually worked with doctors, local community doctors in the area, who are now able to prescribe, to issue a prescription for people to use active travel methods, bikes for hire and so on, free of charge. So what you're seeing is that we're making those connections between improving air quality, reducing congestion, improving people's health, reducing inequality between the richest and the poorest. And that's what happens when you have a lens of an integrated approach to meeting 7 national wellbeing goals, all through the lens of one particular issue. There are a number of other areas that I could talk to about the way that we're now building homes in Wales, an aspiration that the Welsh Government has set for us to be zero waste by 2030. Wales is already leading the world in terms of, well, we're just behind Germany actually, in terms of our recycling rates, but for a small country, that's a pretty impressive accolade. In this last year's budget, based on my scrutiny the previous year and my calling out to government, I cannot see how your spending decisions are meeting your obligations in terms of climate change and in terms of investing in restoring nature, enhancing and protecting biodiversity, as is the legal duty set out in our legislation. And in the last year's budget, we saw the biggest increase in direct spending for decarbonisation and nature-based solutions to tackling climate change and to enhancing and protecting nature. I think now that there are a number of significant opportunities as we move, into this new world of post-COVID, recovery and what the landscape is going to look like there. And what I will post in the chat now is my 5-point plan for COVID recovery, which I published about 6 weeks ago, and have been meeting with government and challenging government in these areas. And I'm very pleased to say that the government have adopted these principles as the main arm of their COVID recovery strategy, which focuses on a green housing-led recovery, so making sure that our social housing in particular is energy efficient. We will do that in a way which focuses on the foundational economy, so making sure that when we're investing in energy efficiency measures in our homes, that we are connecting that with skills, training and local jobs for people in the most economically disadvantaged areas. If you think about some of the approaches that we've already taken using the lens of the Future Generations Act, procuring our PPE, our personal protective equipment for the COVID crisis, the vast majority of that has been done with factories in Wales, presenting opportunities for our lowest paid workers and so on. But back to the housing-led recovery, so we will focus in that area. We will be focusing on how we can ensure that we're only bailing out businesses who are signed up to the principles of the Future Generations Act. So the government has, in line with their requirements under the Act, issued an economic contract which says if you have funding from the government in any form, you must demonstrate how you are decarbonising, how you're focusing on the mental and physical health and well-being of your employees, and you're paying people a decent wage. Prior to COVID, we had 385 businesses in Wales signed up to that economic contract. We now have 5,000 businesses in Wales signed up to that economic contract. And so things are really starting to progress. We will also focus on a green and just recovery. We will be focusing on a skills offer for those who have the widest inequality gaps. So women, Black, Asian and minority ethnic people, young people and those who've been unemployed for the longest period of time. So there's lots to be excited about in Wales. There are some huge challenges with COVID and with the economic downturn and all of the ongoing challenges with lifting lockdown and so on. But I think that we are way ahead of the game in terms of many countries because we do have this blueprint for action. We are not sort of, I suppose, stabbing around in the dark trying to think what's the best thing to do, because our longer term outcomes and aims are set out in our legislation, not just some high level policy document, not just the political manifesto of a particular party who may be in government this time and may not next time, but a long-term aspiration for the people of Wales and for our children and our grandchildren, which the government and other public bodies in Wales need to form everything they do around those principles. So I'll leave it there for now. There's much more that I could talk about, but I know you probably want to ask some questions.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I will stop the recording now, and I've got a lot of questions actually. Yeah.